Great to have you with us today. Great to see so many returning names and faces, as well as some new folks. I saw folks over in the chat introducing themselves all across America, Canada. I think I saw Brazil, a couple of other countries. If you haven't introduced yourself yet, please let us know where you're joining from today in the chat, and then keep that chat open because we'll use that to gather your comments and questions for our special guest. If you're new to this weekly call series, we are I4CP, the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. We define high performance with 4 pretty standard business metrics that you see here: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. When we run our major studies, our quantitative surveys, we're able to tease out those HR, human capital practices that high-performing organizations do more than low performers. We like to particularly hone in not just on best practices that many organizations have in place, but what we call next practices, those that few organizations are doing yet, but that correlate to higher performance. We are a member-based organization, so special welcome to anyone from one of our member companies. You see here just a small sampling of some of those logos. They range from very large organizations like Amazon, Microsoft, 3M, Visa, and many others, as well as some smaller companies. We've got a growing cohort of startups, of unicorn organizations in I4CP membership. They also span across all industry market verticals, from high tech to banking to manufacturing, healthcare, retail, you name it. If you're not with a member organization and would like to learn more, just click that link that Zeta has put over in the chat and you can learn more about it, or reach out to any of us at I4CP and we'd be happy to have that conversation. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I have the pleasure of co-hosting most of these Thursday sessions. This week, my co-host is my colleague, Catherine Brecken, also a senior research analyst here at I4CP. Good morning, Catherine.
Morning, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you with us, and you'll be introducing and facilitating a conversation with our special guest in just a moment, but wanted to note some of the upcoming events we'll have. This is Next Practices Weekly, so as you can see, we'll be meeting again on March 14th with an HR leader from Nordstrom, again on the 21st with an HR leader from Dick's Sporting Goods. We'll then take 1 week off for our conference, which we'll talk a little bit more about throughout the call today. We meet in Scottsdale, Arizona at the Fairmont Princess at the end of March. So there won't be a Thursday call that week, but we hope to see many of you in person at that conference. And then we'll reconvene on April 4th, where we'll have Elliot Mazie, a longtime thought leader in the learning and development space. A really interesting guy who will, along with our CEO, Kevin Oakes, and I, give us his thoughts and a recap of that conference. We do also have some sessions that are more geared towards those that live in the APAC and EMEA regions. We don't have these weekly, but we do have them monthly. You can just scan the QR code there or use the link that Zeta will put in the chat. If you've got colleagues at your organization that live in those regions, we hold those on different days, different times of the day, early in the morning in terms of US time, or late in the evening, which is more appropriate for folks living in those parts of the world. We like here, we have outstanding guests on those calls and talk about all topics within HR. So with that, that's the end of the preliminaries for today. I'm going to turn things over to you, Catherine, to introduce our special guest.
Thanks, Tom. I am so excited to introduce our featured speaker today, Ian Wilson, Vice President of Human Resources for Amazon Web Services, which, if you're not familiar with the AWS acronym, you will be by the end of this call. They are rock stars within Amazon. And Ian also is going to be a featured speaker at our conference coming up here this month. Without further ado, I would love to have Ian tell us a little bit about your impressive career. You've been at a variety of companies, Honeywell and Microsoft. Introduce us and tell us about your journey.
Yeah, hey, good morning, good day, Catherine, Tom. Thanks for having me. Tom, you kept referencing a special guest, and I wasn't quite sure who you were referring to, humbly. So thanks for the opportunity to join for this weekly conversation. Yes, as Catherine said, I've had the chance to be at Amazon in the Human Resources Organization, or actually at Amazon we call it PXT, which stands for People, Experience, and Technology, for about the past 6 years. Most of the time leading the PXT team for Amazon Web Services that you mentioned. Prior to that, spent a good bit of time at Microsoft in a variety of roles for about 14 years. Did a few things in their go-to-market organizations. Spent quite a bit of time in a few of the entertainment businesses there, but also had a chance to play a role in the Windows business, which were what I was doing most recently before I came over to Amazon and Amazon Web Services. I spent my early career at Honeywell. It was actually Allied Signal when I started. Had a stint, a few roles in the aerospace business, the industrial process control business. Had a great time crawling around factories, which I absolutely loved, and was just a fantastic company to really start to develop professionally. Part of that, had the chance to go to school in upstate New York. Cornell University is a nice little spot in Ithaca in the Finger Lakes. If you haven't had a chance to go visit, I recommend you do so. But in the summertime, it's when it's going to treat you the best. But take a look. Originally from the East Coast of the United States, born in Baltimore, grew up in the Philadelphia area. But I've had the chance to live all over the United States. Also lived over in China for a little bit, which was super fun, and continue to be on the grand tour. Just really embrace life and career as just an ongoing journey, and honestly excited to see where we go next.
Yeah, that's a great journey, and I can't wait to hear more. Your AWS HR team spans dozens of countries. You support thousands of employees across the globe. You're in charge of cultivating AWS culture, growing talent, and building capabilities. I'm curious, and I know our audience would love to know, how do you approach delivering an HR agenda to multiple businesses that are so distributed?
Over the course of my career, as you would expect, I've had the chance to see it, done a lot of different ways, and myself to try it as a practitioner and even as a leader of an organization, to come at it, from different perspectives. At this point, I am just so incredibly convicted that you have to formulate, execute, deliver your people agenda. We talk a lot about working backward, especially when it comes to building our businesses and our products and our services. The idea of working backward from the spoken or unspoken needs of our customers. It's what fuels everything that we do. And so for me, it was very easy to grab the vocabulary and apply it to just fundamentally how I think about the work that we do, right? The best HR agendas are very context specific. They're not generic. They're working backward from what's very specific businesses need to thrive and be successful. In fact, the opposite of that is one of the things that is clearly one of my pet peeves, which I affectionately call random acts of HR. And a random act of HR is something that might be actually a really good piece of HR work, but it's generic. And because it's generic, it actually doesn't have any business in being applied in a particular scenario. I think the work we do has got to be bespoke. It has to be tailored, it has to be context specific, and most importantly, working backward from the outcomes that we need to deliver for our businesses and ultimately for our customers.
I love that idea. And I'm sure some of us in the audience who are wondering, how do you scale that? Amazon, AWS are so large. How are you structured to achieve this?
It's interesting, and even in my tenure leading HR for AWS, it's been quite a change. I've been here for about 6 years. When I joined AWS, it was about a $26 billion annual run rate business. And if you look at earnings from last quarter, just about crossing that 100 billion annual run rate business mark. And so really pretty significant growth in a relatively short period of time. And we don't talk too publicly about what that looks like organizationally, but you can pretty much assume that, the organization was scaling at a similar rate. Even as you mentioned, that AWS is in dozens of countries. That's accurate. I think of my last count, it was 54. Which is a significant expansion geographically from when we started. I think the way that we've tried to stay ahead of that, because I think as HR practitioners, you've got to be ahead of it. If you're with your business or you're behind your business, you're just not going to be adding on the value that you can. You've got to get ahead of it. And the way that we've done that is we've just always been very open-minded and very scrappy about reinventing our approach anytime that we needed to. Certainly, if you were to look at how we ran the agenda over the last 6 years, you'd find meaningful differences year over year of how we were running the play. And even if you were to double click on that, you'd find that quarter over quarter, we're constantly iterating to scale our practices. Certainly you'll find some of the usual suspects out there about, structures and how you're growing your structure, expanding your structure, trying to get leverage out of your structure and your investments. But I actually think more importantly are your soft structures. In Amazon, we talk about the mechanisms that we use to run our businesses. Sometimes you think of those as your business processes or your management, operating cadences and things like that. You just have to be constantly tweaking and iterate on those, being very vocally self-critical. Are these things working for us or not? And when you find out that they're not exactly doing what you need them to, you just have to get on with it and make sure that you're tweaking, iterating, or fundamentally reinventing along the way. I think that's the way that you stay ahead of something that is growing and changing and evolving as fast as something like AWS. I think the other piece that I would just say is, it is in the spirit of being vocally self-critical, which is something we talk a lot about at Amazon, but you can't be dogmatic about anything. You can't hold beliefs that this is the right way to do it, or this is what I believe. If you approach it that way, you're going to find yourself wandering down often an inappropriate or unhelpful path. You just have to be able to constantly challenge yourself, challenge your assumptions, and let go of the things that don't make sense in the context of what you're trying to do.
I think that's fascinating, especially with such rapid growth that you just described, and the reinvention that you talk about. You have to be open to continually, which really makes me excited to talk to you about culture. I know you'll be expanding on this topic at our conference, but can you describe the culture at Amazon, and is that different from your experience at AWS, and how has it changed, at least since you've been there since 2018?
Yeah, excellent questions. At Amazon, we take our culture very seriously. In many contexts, we describe it as our most important asset. It is the thing that our customers experience, and customer obsession is the anchor of our culture. It just fuels so much of what we do operationally, but more importantly, how we behave and how we operate together. Everything is about innovating on behalf of our customers, delivering for our customers, so that they can be successful in whatever they're trying to do. I suspect that many of you may be Amazon customers, and hopefully you feel that in how you think about the company, the brand, the experience you have, is that you're dealing with a bunch of folks that really care about the things that you're trying to achieve and helping you be successful. A few other hallmarks of the Amazon cultures, I would say. There's this idea that we talk a lot about, which is it's always day one. And I'll share with you, when I joined Amazon, it took me a little bit to really figure out, what is this day one thing, all about? And to me, the way I've internalized it essentially means that every single day, no matter what happened yesterday or last week or last year, every single day, we all have permission and are expected to look at the data and the anecdotes in front of us and make the best possible decisions we can for our customers today. And the best thing about this idea of it always day one is you do that today, and you also get to do it tomorrow. And it allows you to be really present, always looking forward, but not holding on to the things that you did before that maybe weren't the right things to do, or maybe you learned something new and you really have to apply that learning, real time. And this idea of having a day one mindset. The other piece that I would just offer that is so incredibly powerful about the culture at Amazon are these things that we call our leadership principles, which they're easy to find. They're out there if you do a search for them, but they really talk about some of the nuances of the things that we think are just so fundamentally important in the Amazon culture.
Speaking of your leadership principles, there are quite a few. And we're not doing slides today. We're not going to PowerPoint people to death. I love that. But can you talk to a few of those? Which ones are the most important? Which ones do you think drive the culture, I guess, are the most influential in driving culture?
Yeah, great. First thing I'd say is, often people, when they say, wow, you have 16 leadership principles, they say, wow, that's a lot of leadership principles. How do you remember them all? And there's two ways that I talk about it. First of all, I'll say something like, well, you have 16 friends, right? And you know their names, right? You know what they care about. You know what they like to eat. So it's really not that hard. But I think the key piece about it is the leadership principles aren't like, things that we're just trying to memorize, as a thought exercise. I remember in grade school, like trying to memorize like all the capitals of all the countries of the world. And it was like this this thing that I was trying to do. Our leadership practices or principles are practices, or things that we're doing all the time. And because we're doing them all the time, we're talking about them with each other all the time, we do remember them, and we do apply them in all sorts of different contexts. That word that I just used around practices is actually the way that our CEO, Andy Jassy, clarifies what are these leadership principles. They're not goals, they're not objectives, they're not values, they're practices. None of us are fully proficient in them because there's no such thing. It's day one, right? You're always trying to improve. And that's what we do. We practice them, we reflect on them, we talk about them. And that's how we keep them very vibrant. And that's why it's not a tax to try to memorize what they are, because they're participating with us in everything that we do. Leadership principles, very much, like our children, like we don't really have favorites, or we shouldn't have favorites, but I can tell you there's a couple that, really are very powerful. Customer obsession, which is one that I touched on there briefly. Obviously a really big deal given how that anchors our culture. There's one that I spend a lot of time with called, learn and be curious, which is just the idea that all of us are just constantly trying to figure it out. And it's odd, but, the more confident we become in knowing what's going on or what a solution might be, actually, the more skeptical we get of our confidence, because we're just really, really the most curious folks that you could ever run into. There's things like bias for action, which are obviously really key to deliver results, which are very, very key. The one thing we do embrace with the leadership principles is that there's tension between them. You can look at them all together and say, well, how can you actually, strive to deliver results and be customer obsessed? Aren't there times when those things are a tension? It's like, absolutely. But the tension between them is actually what prevents them from becoming fixed. It's an open sort of process. You have to have a very open mindset to how you think about them, because there is tension. It invites discussion, it invites judgment. That's one thing that keeps us, again, back to this idea of being day one, very present in everything that we're doing.
I love that. And I kind of think about that tension too. And if you go back to, working backwards, that concept that you talked about at the beginning of the call, I think that can really be a good framework to decide, and determine, between the tension, which way to go, right? So I love how that all works together.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So in terms of the employee experience and how the average Amazonian lives day to day, how do those leadership principles, I guess, get realized in the employee experience? What are some of the specific practices you've had success with in sort of upholding that culture?
Yeah, so the leadership principles, we talk about them being active participants in everything we do. And so really, you'd be surprised. You'll find yourself in a conversation, talking about a customer opportunity, and you think you're talking about, a feature or a facet of a particular solution. And the next thing you know, you find yourself in a 40-minute conversation about an element of our culture. And our leaders are actively talking about it, literally in the flow of everything that we do. As you would expect, you see them very deeply integrated in every people practice that we have. Everything we do, for example, from a hiring perspective, revolves around the leadership principles. If you're going through the interview process with Amazon, you're being interviewed based on the leadership principles. I should say this, by the way, if you haven't ever interviewed at Amazon, I think you should. One, yeah, you might find that this is a great opportunity for you and it's going to be a perfect fit and you can really thrive here. But even if it's not the case, going through the interview process, because it's very rigorous. We take it very seriously. As HR practitioners, I think you would learn a lot just going through that process with us. But you'd find, again, leadership principles is all fully wedded into that process. How we think about our talent reviews, how we look at promotions, all of our talent management practices. Who do we tap, for bigger roles? Who do we think can take on a stretch? Our people practices are all anchored on our leadership principles, which keeps them very formally anchored into the system. I think that's incredibly important, and we take that very seriously. But honestly, it's the way that we use our leadership principles in the flow of work as we innovate for customers that actually keeps them very vibrant, very alive, and very front and center in the employee experience.
I love it. That tight alignment is so important, and that you guys really do that at every touch point in the employee experience is amazing. Very cool.
One of the I appreciate you calling out tight alignment. One of the words that I choose to use, and I think about, people systems and culture in particular, is the idea of it's coherent. Your people practices have got to be coherent in the system, and I think I have certainly found that at Amazon, especially as it pertains to the culture.
I want to ask a poll question at this point to the audience, very relevant to culture. I4CP, this is, we have more culture research, organizational culture research than any other human capital research firm out there. This is what we do, and we have been studying this for years, but since the pandemic, there has been a lot of change, not only in our ways of working, but our talent practices. The Great Resignation and so forth is still tight labor market. Supply chain issues, all of those things. I want to ask the audience here, how has your organization's culture changed since the onset of the pandemic? If Zeta, lovely Zeta, if you could bring up the poll responses here.
Yeah, they're coming in, and
Okay.
here we go. We've got, looks like, become slightly healthier. That's good to see that is such a strong result at 53%. Slightly more toxic, the inverse of healthy, at 22%, but also more that said much healthier versus very toxic. So interesting results here. Ian, would be interested to hear what's gone on at AWS and broader Amazon in terms of culture, in the past 3-4 years. Were there any specific changes or things you implemented? Any of the leadership principles that were developed or changed during that time, or what would you say?
Well, first of all, these poll results, really resonate with me. And if I were to offer a hypothesis, it's that, the pandemic caused us to go through some pretty, inorganic, periods of change, whether it's how we work with each other, how we communicate with each other. And when you do that, there's kind of a fork in the road. You're either going to lose your culture and it's going to fall away, into the background, or you're going to bring it forward. Certainly, that's what we experienced for a couple of things. One, going through the changes of caused by the pandemic and some of the economic uncertainty on the other side of it. Also during that time, many of our Amazon businesses were expanding significantly. So we were doing a lot of hiring. And as I mentioned, culture is front and center in our hiring, and also I should say our onboarding practices. But also as the way of work was changing, we were very scrappily inventing new practices to continue to strengthen our culture as we are working more remote and virtual. I have a belief, and we sometimes talk about the idea that culture is caught, not taught, meaning that culture is found and it's reinforced and strengthened through interpersonal reaction, mostly in-person, not interpersonal reaction. And as that was kind of going down a little bit through the pandemic, we had to augment, our system to make sure that our culture was continuing on this path of being strengthened. So that's a little bit of what we were up to, but I think it resonates with what I saw in the poll results there. It's, if your culture was important to you and you were going through these changes, you had to bring a lot more intentionality to it than maybe you had in the past. If your culture wasn't important to you, then certainly the last couple of years probably invited, quite a bit of drift. There is one thing that I would like to comment on this, and I think, Catherine, you may have asked the question, how do we think about maintaining our culture, or how do we, or I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly what the word you used, but the one thing that I offer is, I have a very strong point of view that how you go after culture, it's an offensive proposition, not a defensive proposition. What I mean by that is you have to constantly be working on it. I choose to use the word strengthen. Sometimes I use the word cultivate. You're constantly trying to build and create your culture. You're not trying to protect it. You're not trying to preserve it. Sometimes they use that word, how do we preserve our culture? How do we protect is another different word. I think anytime a group of people has tried to protect their culture, it hasn't really worked out well, because it just fundamentally, in my opinion, doesn't work that way. You have to be constantly creating, building culture. I like the word cultivate or strengthen the culture. So just wanted to share that perspective.
If I can jump in real quick on that, I like the word cultivate. I like the word build. One of the analogies that I've thought of over the years for both culture and other important aspects of business life is an analogy to a garden, where it's something where you need to seed various things throughout the organization. You need to water it to keep replenishing it regularly. You need to weed it to get out any negativity that might be impeding the culture. There's just a lot of aspects to growing a garden that I think are good analogies to maintaining and further developing a culture.
100%. Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. And Tom, maybe this is a good time to look at the next slide here. And Ian, I'd love to get your take on this. So this is from I4CP's Culture Fitness report that we put out in 2023, where we really looked at the changes of organizations' cultures since the pandemic. And we found these 7 habits of very healthy cultures from our global survey, some of which you really mentioned are super prevalent at Amazon. I've definitely heard a lot about a learning mindset, but kind of reflecting on we've got a couple of comments here in the chat where we ask people how, if your culture has gotten healthier, what have you experienced? What has it been? And remote work, Didi, I get it. I hear that. I hear that all the time too. But I would love to also talk about Lisa's. She's got healthier equals more care for people and understanding unique family needs, caretaking stress, seeing flexibility as more of a benefit and a competitive advantage. We've also seen a lot of tension since there's been, a lot of economic turmoil between this idea of, emphasizing productivity and performance in companies versus this, their employees' well-being, which was, front and center during the pandemic. I'm curious in your take on that transition. And how is Amazon reinforcing care for its employees? Obviously, it's very performance mindset. You guys do great, great work. The markets, says that about you all. So I'm curious how you maintain that sort of culture of caring and well-being in your employees as well.
Yeah, a few things I'd absolutely comment on. I mean, certainly just in responding to this slide, I think it was this piece about, healthy culture. It won't surprise you, going back to my first comments, healthy in context, right? I don't think that all cultures across all of our organizations should remotely look the same because we're trying to achieve different things. We have different customers, we have different operating models. So I think of effective culture as much as I think about, a healthy culture in the context of what your firm, may or may not be trying to do. Certainly, this piece about ensuring you understand what your employees, and in many parts of Amazon, we talk about our employees as builders, so, what's important to our builders, what do our builders need to be successful and to thrive individually and collectively, and how does your culture, attune to that? One of the things that we did with our leadership principles, in fact, is relatively recently we introduced 2 new leadership principles. And one of the new leadership principles was striving to be Earth's best employer, which I think was very much in time of us as an organization really thinking about that next level of how we think more deeply about what our employees need to thrive, and then how do we get ourselves oriented to do that. So I think that was certainly very true given what's played out over the last couple of years. Quite honestly, I think there's also some more secular things that are happening in society globally around us that are requiring that employers are much more attuned to the needs of their workforce, and we certainly are embracing that.
Oh. We have a question here from Marlo also. He asks, is your culture quantified? And if so, how, and do you set specific targets?
It's interesting. This question about how do we measure the strength of our culture is maybe how I might think about that. And I can assure you that we are using as much science as we possibly can across the spectrum to really get dialed in and think about it. One of the things that we are particularly passionate about are our various employee listening systems, as we describe them. Amazon has something that's called connections. And every single day, every employee in Amazon gets a connections question. For most, it comes up on their laptop. For some, it comes up on their mobile device or whatever the device is that they use to do their work. That allows us to stay real time in touch with how our employees are doing. And many of the things that we're curious about through our connections is how they are practicing and experiencing the culture. So that's one thing we certainly look at. But also, again, this idea of culture effectiveness and context. We think very much about the performance of our respective businesses and teams, as it relates to customer outcomes and where we find success and where we have opportunities, where we're constantly, learning and being curious about really what's going on culturally across those various organizations. I do think this piece about culture measurement, I think we need more science. And this is one of the areas that I actually am very excited about generative AI and the technologies that will come related to generative AI. I think there's going to be some pretty meaningful breakthroughs in how we can measure culture as these technologies become more pervasive. And I'm very excited about what that might look like over the next couple of years here.
And I want to hear more about that. That is, we are going to get into that here shortly. Before we do, I want to quickly do one more poll question, which sort of relates to the listening that you talked about, as well as the leadership principles. We wanted to ask the audience here, to what extent does your organization clearly communicate its values to employees, or to what extent are you hearing those values communicated? I think some of the methods that you just talked about, Ian, in terms of listening, sort of really help us understand if that message is getting out, right? Let's see here what folks say.
Yeah,
and it
the
also
votes are
speaks to the
coming in.
alignment.
Yeah,
Mhm.
we'll give this one a couple more seconds. This was one of the practices on the last slide. One of those 7 key healthy habits of a strong culture is clearly communicating values, leaders doing so to the organization, to the employees. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and let the two of you discuss the results.
Excellent. So I think having 33% say high extent, 16% very high extent. Those are fantastic numbers. What are your thoughts on this, Ian?
This is great to see, and it's interesting. Where my mind goes, I have to be honest, is the next question in the series, which we might not ask today, which is, to what extent does your organization live the values? Because I think there is a progression of how you become a value-centered organization. Certainly, articulating them, communicating them, feels like table stakes. Like you've got to do that, to get squared away. But really, the way you strengthen culture over time, in my opinion, is how you live the values. And I've been in all sorts of organizations, throughout my career. And honestly, some of the ones that I find to be least effective from a culture perspective are those that are communicating one set of values and they're living an entirely different set of values. And when you lack that coherence between those two things, I think you're actually in a pretty problematic state. So I'd be curious, to what extent are we living the values, and to what extent are the articulated values and the lived values coherent with each other? I think those are pretty interesting questions to ask as a complement to this one. But this is great to see. My other curiosity goes to, I wonder if we were to ask this community of folks this question 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, 80 years ago, how we may have seen some different Pareto of these responses. I'm glad to see that this is what we're seeing today.
Absolutely. And Cameron here is echoing your sentiment that there can sometimes be a disconnect between communication versus the application of company values. Our research at I4CP, we have quantitative evidence that really supports when leaderships demonstrate or consistently demonstrate organizational values, you are much more likely to have healthier cultures, a higher employee productivity, better trust, and better market performance. And so when employees really see leaders walking the walk, if they report that, that is an excellent sign, and not just this communication component that you talked about, as well. You've got to walk the walk for sure.
Yep.
And I think that's an excellent segue, Tom, to our sort of next topic here. I'm very excited to hear more about connecting culture with business transformation, and specifically with technological change, which Amazon has got some amazing tech features out there that we've been reading about. Can you tell us sort of what's happening within your organization and how Amazon is managing the change? It's
interesting. Well, certainly, as you referenced, I'll have the chance to join the conference, here in a couple of weeks. I'm looking forward to talking about this more. It's fascinating times, but very much, one of the ways that we're thinking about it is, and I do humbly recognize that that when we do this work at Amazon, we have the fortune of being very connected to, some of the individual leaders, the teams, the talents, the organizations that are pushing the boundaries of a lot of these technologies. So we're very much in the fray, in the mix of it. But again, if I talk about anything around culture and culture transformation, how you think about it, it's this belief that you embrace the idea that your culture is a dynamic idea. I think we've gotten ourselves into trouble as practitioners by thinking of culture as a static idea. And you think about culture as a static idea, then you fall into the trap of these things of, well, you have to go from a from state to a to state. You have to unfreeze, you have to refill, all these sort of things that we've all taught each other and learned about when you think about culture in a static way. I think the world today, because of societal trends, but especially because of what we're experiencing from a technology perspective, demands that we think about culture as something that's much more dynamic. It's probably always been that way, and we've gotten away with sort of applying some artificial constructs to it, but we're not going to be able to get away with that anymore. Things are just moving too fast, evolving too fast. People are changing too fast. There's too much technology that is being introduced at a very, very, very rapid clip. That we're going to have to embrace a new mindset about how we think about culture and transformation and things along these lines.
Definitely. And our research shows that, organizations that think of change as a business model, to be the disruptor, they embrace change, much more likely to have higher market performance and healthier cultures and so forth. So really that mindset that it's okay to change, change is okay, it is so beneficial and has a cascade of benefits. This chart here kind of goes with the next question, but I'll explain what we're looking at here. Our last study that we did on how HR is working with generative AI, we asked 1,500 survey participants across the globe, how are they applying generative AI to HR today? Of those that are, you'll see on the left here, this is sort of where they said they were using generative AI at the time. This is July data. And on the right here, we had created a maturity index. Those organizations that really were embracing or cautiously implementing generative AI with parameters, and had a number of sort of talent practices that helped their workforce leverage safely and effectively generative AI. We call those AI innovators because they were sort of the top of the scale of what their practices were doing. On the right here, that's where they were planning to use generative AI next. So I kind of like to think of this as like, this is where the future of HR is going. So with that said, with the onset of generative AI, how do you see this disruptive technology impacting the HR function?
I think it's going to be very significant. But a couple of things I would say. First, I just encourage all of us to really embrace this idea that it is unbelievably early in our understanding of the potential of these technologies. If I use, the automotive industry as a metaphor, generative AI is not, the next version of the Tesla Cybertruck. Where we are from a GenAI perspective, it's like pre-Model T. It is just so incredibly early in how all of this is going to play out as more capacity comes online, as more science is applied, and we move things forward. The other thing I would say is I think there's some people that use the words generative AI, large language model, and chatbot as synonymous ideas. And they're not. They're very different ideas. And I know why we might think about that way because of how many people were introduced to the technology or what was popularized with the technology over the last couple of years. But generative AI is fundamentally about so much more than just large language models, and certainly way more than chatbots, which I'm going to guess across many things on this slide, that's really what is happening in this space. The way that I think about generative AI, it's about the application of technology to unstructured data. And I think if you just go back to that as almost a first principle, then you can really start to imagine how this has the potential to impact the work that we do as practitioners in pretty fundamental ways. Even going back to the idea of this notion of how do you measure culture? Well, geez, how culture is expressed in an organization is about an unstructured data set as you're going to get, right? You're talking about nuances in human behavior. As researchers right now, we're kind of sort of stuck of needing people to express something through like a survey or some other maybe observable sort of technique that doesn't really scale really well. Well, in the world of generative AI, if you really have the courage to go there, you can apply a human behavior observation at scale with technology, with the speed and compute potential that's unlike anything that we've had before. And all of a sudden, we're able to think about something like simple, like culture measurement in just a radically, radically different way. So I encourage all of us to embrace those ideas. We are unbelievably early in what these technologies have the potential to help us all with as a species, literally going forward. I would encourage us to kind of see through what many of us are experiencing today around chatbots and large language models and really think about this idea of the application of technology, just like broad sets of unstructured data, and then give ourselves the ability as practitioners to dream a little bit in terms of what's going to be possible.
So I want to go back to your earlier comment on what you envision generative AI could do to help us measure culture. Where do you see that going specifically? I've got some colleagues in people analytics who are doing wonderful things with the unstructured data of open response questions, that many of our listening mechanisms employ. Before we've had to manually code them or use, very expensive large language models. And now we're finding we can do it with, GPTs, and it's getting far more simple and accessible to measure those. So I would be curious to see how do you see that going? Where is it going?
Yeah, I'll give you one example, and then I'll be just, unfortunately, just a little bit vague on what I think comes next because there's some things that we're working on. But, I mentioned connections as an example, and in our employee listening systems. Many of our employees get a question of, what is the one thing you want your leader to know about today? And if you go back a year or so ago, like we had teams that were kind of taking that and doing some, more traditional, data processing and things like that to try to give real-time summary to our organization leaders to know what's top of mind for their builders. And now we're leveraging generative AI to do that in a very, very different way and just very quickly. The level of insight, the efficiency of how we get the insight, the speed of the insight, how we can look at patterns and do more sophisticated analytics with it very quickly is changing something like that. But then again, I would just say that practice, as we've developed it, is still dependent upon asking somebody a question and having them answer it. In the future, I think we'll be able to get an understanding of that sentiment without ever having to ask that question, because we'll just kind of find it in the unstructured data that just is pervasive, through all of our organizations.
That's a very interesting projection, and a little bit scary too, because in the course of your day-to-day interactions with digital technology, you're not always thinking about the power of that to influence the organization, or even because people talk about the same thing, like you'll be able to find candidates without them ever applying, and basically create offers for them without them ever applying based on the data that's out there. That's another thing I hear about a lot, and so. It's just a scary world right there.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the one thing I would say, definitely I will self-identify as an optimist. And when I look at kind of the course of the human experience, we've invented a lot of stuff. And so many of the things that we've invented can be used for good and some things can be used for bad. But so far we've gotten it right and we're doing okay as a species. And I'm optimistic that we'll continue to do so. And particularly with the topic of generative AI, I am very pleased and proud that as early as we are in the technology, there's a lot of conversation in a lot of forums. Certainly in my company, I know in many of the companies on the line across industry, there's a lot of early conversation about how are we thoughtfully going to apply these technologies, and I think that's gonna keep us on course. But like with any technology introduction, it is going to be new, and it's going to unlock new opportunities and new experiences that certainly 10 years ago weren't imagined, and in the present times we're imagining them. We're going to be asking a lot of critical questions about these, but I believe that we're going to be very thoughtful about it, and I think we're going to get it right.
And I want to ask you more about that, but Tom has flashed this this awesome graph here, and I would love to have him sort of speak to it a little bit more. But what we're looking at is really why that's happening, Ian, right? Those organizations that are using generative AI in HR, they are already experiencing some wonderful, as well as some negative outcomes that you can see here. Tom, do you want to explain why this chart is so pertinent to this conversation?
Yeah, well, I can just segue off, Ian, what you said, the opportunities that are being presented, you being an optimist. I too sort of self-identify as an optimist. I have my entire life. What you're seeing here is, again, from our survey from last summer, outcomes of those that are already either experimenting or fully using generative AI. You see time savings and increased productivity being the two largest outcomes at 56% each. Yes, cost savings, which could come from fewer people needed in certain roles, or just cost savings from, again, time savings and increased productivity. Other ones, enhanced quality. A lot of these sort of roll up into the classic business triad. Any new initiative, any new technology, cost, time, quality. It's always a balance of where you're going to find the most benefit. I'm curious, Ian, what you're seeing already at Amazon, or just as you think about AI use across organizations. I assume you would agree with us that it'll be this sort of balancing of cost reduction, but will also decrease time for work and increase quality of output as well. Where do you see the balance happening?
I certainly think early it's going to be many of these things. But honestly, in the fullness of time, it's going to be something that's not on this chart at all, which is the innovation and expansion that comes with the application of the new technology. And I'll talk about two things that many of us are going to be familiar with. The introduction of the personal computer, a rather big deal in terms of a technology transformation. And in the early days, I'm sure the conversation about, the PC was about time savings, productivity, cost savings, things like that. But that really wasn't what it happened to be. It turned out to be like, how do you empower individuals to get more done as individuals, to come up with new ideas, to build things in new and different ways? Similarly, when you think about, the public cloud and what AWS pioneered. In the early days, for some, maybe it was about, cost savings and things like that. But really what it's turned into is the ability to innovate in ways that you can never innovate before. You look at all these companies out there that we call cloud native or digital native companies that were born on the cloud. Like they did not exist before the cloud, and they're only possible because of the cloud. That expansion, that growth, the new ideas, the new experiences, the new ways that we're helping people thrive more, be more capable, be more successful in the fullness of time. That's what this technology promises. So I think it's going to be the balance between how do we get more productive, how do we optimize around time and cost and things like that. But the much more interesting part of this is going to be, what are all the new opportunities that we have together as people because of these technologies that we just didn't have before.
Well, Ian, we don't just have being optimists in common, you and I. I have the same sort of line of thinking. Whenever I present on this topic with this data, I always note something similar by saying that, yes, initially time savings and increased productivity are what we're seeing most commonly reported. But down the road, the ability to divert employees to new tasks or to free them up to be more creative, more innovative, I think we'll see that being a much more common, more powerful outcome. And also reducing burnout, increasing well-being. I think that 15% right now, but I think as we get time savings, productivity, cost reductions, quality, and all these more core metrics, I think we'll see that increase as well. So glad we're definitely aligned in that way of thinking.
But I do want to ask, because there's the two bottom ones there. 13% of our participants were already experiencing increased data privacy and security risks, as well as reduced jobs and positions. And so I'm curious, Ian, what impact might generative AI have on jobs and work, and what do we need to be prepared for as HR professionals and get ready for?
I do think work's going to change. Again, if I compare it to other introductions of significantly disruptive technology, I do think work is going to change. It's not going to change for everybody, and for some roles, it's going to change more than less. I think that is going to be absolutely true. It's interesting. You try to think about this at a macro and micro level. At a macro level, I don't think there's going to be a net reduction of opportunities for people. I believe there's going to be more opportunities for people because the technology is going to unlock those, just like Tom and I were chatting about. But I think it's going to play out very much along those lines. And in terms of the micro or the individual impact, you're seeing some companies out there that are specifically linking changes in their workforce to the introduction of these technologies. And I double click on many of those to really be curious about what they're experiencing and what they're trying and what's happening. So I think there will be some of that, but I don't think that's going to be the big conversation in time about how this all plays out. I'll give you an example. Very early on in this, I was on a panel, and I had a very powerful experience with a member of the audience who had a child who had just enrolled at one of the top universities in the world to study computer science. And she said, Ian, should I tell my son to switch majors? And I'm like, oh, please don't. Like, the world is going to need computer scientists. And what I said to her is, and the world is going to need entry-level software development engineers. In 4 years, what an entry-level software development engineer does is going to look different than what they do today. But guess what? What they do today looks very different than what they did 4 years ago, and certainly is radically different than what they did 20 years ago. So that is going to continue to happen, right? The introduction of technology is going to change how we work tactically, conceptually, how we relate to each other. But the work, the opportunity, the chance for us to come together and do special things as people, that's not going anywhere. And that's going to be here for a long, long time.
Absolutely. And, as someone mentioned in the chat, they're from a small company. They talked about the importance of experimenting and trying this new technology. We know, that our data shows, and I'll put the article here in the chat, that the number of HR job descriptions mentioning AI related skills has tripled since 2019. And Amazon, by the way, has some fantastic public facing courses that you can take to learn more about generative AI if you're curious. But I did want to ask you, because you invited us all to apply to experience, the Amazon hiring experience and how you tie those leadership principles to the employee experience at every step. But I am curious, what do you look for in HR professionals to join your team? And are there any interesting new trends that you're seeing in the job market?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that definitely stand out for me, and going all the way back to my initial comments about being very specific to working back from the business. When I look at the practitioners that I like to hang out with, I need people who are great business people. They're curious about business. They have business acumen. They understand how to think about effectiveness through the lens of business, not just kind of purely from a people system perspective. It's that application of the crafts that we all have into business context that I think is very, very important. Something that is absolutely culture specific for Amazon and AWS, but honestly, probably also something I'd almost always look for universally, are builders. Like people who can see opportunities and then they have the grit, the perseverance, and the motor to like go do something, like get something done. Observation is important and it can be fun sometimes, but like, let's go create, let's go build, let's go make something happen. So I look for people who have the energy and the knack and the desire to do those sorts of things. But also, I'm very curious to find people who love to embrace transformation, who want to be on the cutting edge. Certainly with what we're talking about from a technology perspective, I think that's very true. But I also think that's true from a people science perspective. The people who want to be on the cutting edge of what are we learning? Like, what's the latest thing that we're learning about human behavior and social behavior and how people come together and relate to each other? People who are really eager to push those boundaries are people that I really like to hang out with.
Well, I think that the message of embracing change is a really positive one for us to end on, and we are at the top of the hour. Ian, it's been a thrill to talk to you for the past hour. As you guys can see here, come to the conference. If you can't come in person, attend virtually. You'll hear more from Ian on culture, but there's also other great speakers too that you'd enjoy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to wrap us up.
Well, I certainly want to double down on thanking Ian for being an outstanding guest. You're getting lots of thanks and kudos from folks over in the chat. People were also throughout the hour calling out some of your your words of wisdoms and turns of phrase that they thought were particularly compelling. So thank you, Ian. It's been a great conversation.
No, thanks for the opportunity to join the conversation. I am always trying to learn as much as I can myself. So I appreciate what you all do at I4CP. I certainly rely on you in significant ways, but also just from all of my colleagues here in the chat. I haven't been able to consume all of this, but hopefully I'll have the chance because I'd love to learn from all of you as well. So thank you so much for hosting this session.
Yeah, and we will do that. We'll send you the transcript so you can see what everyone had to say, Ian. By way of closing out, I just want to note these Next Practice Weekly sessions are available for recertification credit hours with both HRCI and SHRM. So if that applies to you, if you've got a certification and need those recert credit hours, just jot down the relevant program ID or activity ID that you see on the screen and that Zeta also put over in the chat. As a final reminder, our conference is coming up quick. You see Ian there in the top right as one of our many great speakers that we've got coming up in Scottsdale, Arizona, March 25th through the 28th. You see a mix of CHROs, other HR leaders, book authors, CEOs, and others. It's going to be a great event. This conference, unlike most, doesn't have a trade show or an expo, so there's no vendors, no trade show like that hitting you up in the hallways. It's just HR leaders, peer-to-peer, sharing great best and next practices. So if you haven't signed up yet, it's not too late. Go to i4cp.com/conference to learn more. And with that, I'll once again just thank everyone. Thank you, Zeta. Thank you, Catherine. And a special thank you to you, Ian. Great conversation today. And thank all of you for attending today and being with us. Thanks for participating. I hope you have a great rest of your week.